Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Southernization of America, a story of democracy in the balance, by Frye Gaillard and Cynthia Tucker. Narrated by Paul Heitsch and Diana Blue. Introduction. In 1974, the great Southern journalist John Egerton wrote a prescient book entitled The Americanization of Dixie, the Southernization of America. In a series of connected but self-contained essays, he made the point that something fundamental was changing, both in his native South and in the country as a whole. But even Egerton seemed not to be sure exactly how things would unfold. He was, as those of us who knew him could attest, one of the great and gentle souls of his time, a man deeply committed to racial justice, who wanted badly to believe that it would be a good thing if this troubled place in which he lived, this part of America that had once fought a war on the right to own slaves, could emerge from the strife of the civil rights years, somehow chastened and wiser for the journey. If it could narrow its distance from the rest of the country, and perhaps even lead it toward better days. That was the hope. But Egerton, as was his habit, saw darker possibilities as well. Giving voice to his fears, he wrote, "The South and the nation are not exchanging strengths as much as they are exchanging sins. More often than not, they are sharing and spreading the worst in each other, while the best languishes and withers. There are exceptions, of course, but the dominant trends are unmistakable. Deep divisions along race and class lines, an obsession with growth and acquisition and consumption, a headlong rush to the cities and suburbs, diminution and waste of natural resources, institutional malfunctioning, abuse of political and economic power, increasing depersonalization, and a steady erosion of a sense of place, of community, of belonging." For a while, it was easy enough to make the case that Egerton's gloom was misplaced, or at least overstated. The anecdotal evidence was all around. In Virginia, Republican Governor Linwood Holton had stunned political observers when he was elected in 1969 on a promise of racial reconciliation. In contrast to the Southern Democrats, who had controlled Virginia for 100 years, Holton proclaimed that the era of defiance, of resistance to civil rights progress, was coming to an end. He supported school desegregation, appointed women and minorities to state government, and promised to make Virginia a model in race relations. In Florida, new Democratic Governor Reuben Askew sounded nearly identical themes. He supported busing as a tool for integrating schools, a moral and educational imperative, he said, and while appointing African Americans to the highest levels of state government, he set such a standard for integrity and competence that Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government rated him one of the top 10 governors of the 20th century. And, of course, there was Jimmy Carter. Elected governor of Georgia in 1970, Carter proclaimed in his inaugural address that the time for racial discrimination is over. Easily the most ambitious of these new South champions, he soon set out for the presidency, with Southernness at the heart of his appeal. He said, "I've been the product of an emerging South. I see the clear advantages of throwing off the millstone of racial prejudice. I think it's a process that's compatible with the moral and ethical standards of our nation, the heritage of our country, as envisioned by our forefathers. I also see that we have a special responsibility here. When we are meek or quiescent or silent on the subject of civil rights at home or human rights abroad, there is no other voice on earth that can replace the lost voice, the absent voice of the United States. This is what the persecutors want, and this is what the persecuted fear." For many Americans, it was mesmerizing. a peanut farmer from the deepest South reconnecting the country with its finest ideals. In 1976, when Carter won the Democratic nomination, he stood side by side at the National Convention, gazing out across the sea of delegates, with Martin Luther King Sr. There they were, two native Georgians, one black, one white, a Southern governor and a civil rights lion, sharing a moment that felt like a revival, not only of the faith they both proclaimed, but of a dream deferred, of shining hopes and possibilities in which so many of us wanted to believe. "Surely the Lord," shouted Daddy King over the mad cacophony of music and cheers amid descending balloons, "is in this place." There was intoxication in the moment, but we knew it was shadowed by something very different, the realities John Egerton was writing about. In the presidential election of 1968, Richard Nixon had embarked on a Southern strategy, but he did not mean the things that Jimmy Carter was telling us. In a sense, Nixon's mentor had been George Wallace. He watched in private admiration as the Alabama governor, who had pledged in 1963 his commitment to segregation forever, learned to redefine his appeal. In the presidential primaries of 1964 and 68, Wallace spoke more obliquely about race, almost as if he were teaching the nation how to think in code. By the time he famously stood in the schoolhouse door, he had begun to polish that skill. Everybody understood, in the summer of 1963, the mission at hand, how Wallace was embarked on a doomed, quixotic quest to block the admission of black students Vivian Malone and James Hood to the University of Alabama. But just as secessionists 100 years earlier had talked about states' rights when they really meant slavery, Wallace cast the federal government as a bully, an outside force pursuing integration without regard for the will of the people, and himself as a noble defender of freedom. A few years later, on the campaign trail for the presidency, he found it useful not to mention segregation, but to talk about liberal sob sisters or bleeding heart sociologists or some bearded Washington bureaucrat who can't even park a bicycle straight. All the shared resentments were there, but he and his audience felt shielded from the charge, his accusers frustrated as they attempted to make it, that they were bigots at heart. There were times when he couldn't contain himself. Once, in 1968, he invoked the specter of urban riots, those moments when African-American rage, often in response to police brutality, erupted into violence, became, in a sense, a magnified reflection of the crime. "We don't have riots down in Alabama," Wallace roared, bantam-weight defiance flashing in his eyes. "They start a riot down there, first one of them to pick up a brick gets a bullet to the brain, and then you walk over to the next one and say, 'All right, pick up a brick. We just want to see you pick up one of them bricks now.'" Newsman Douglas Kiker of NBC, observing the response of a Midwestern crowd, was struck by a sudden, horrifying epiphany. They all hate black people. All of them. They're all afraid. Great God, that's it. They're all Southern. The whole United States is Southern. There were African-American activists, people like James Baldwin or Malcolm X, who begged to differ. Both had written with urgency about the indigenous racism of the North. But if the story was more complicated, if racism had already taken root in every nook and corner of America, was there, nevertheless, something in Kiker's moment of revelation? In this era of homogenization, when television and interstate highways, and soon enough the Internet, were erasing the isolation of the South, pulling it into the national mainstream, was there something about our place that was beginning to reshape the country? And if there was, might it be a source of mystical promise? Or was it, more inevitably, a reality overflowing with dread. In the following essays, more reflections than a narrative history, we consider the Southernization of America from the time John Egerton coined the term, the eve of the Carter presidency, through the toxic era of Donald Trump. It may well be, as some have also said of Black history, that the story of the South is the story of America, with all the implied pain and promise. The Fragile Promise. Frye Gaillard and Cynthia Tucker. In the beginning, the thing that set him apart was ambition. Jimmy Carter had been governor for less than 2 years when he attended the Democratic National Convention and toyed, half seriously, with the possibility of becoming George McGovern's running mate. Certainly, there were those in his entourage, including young aide Hamilton Jordan, who were quick to push his case. McGovern, however, was not very interested, and for Carter it was probably just as well. McGovern, in 1972, represented the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. He was a war hero who hated war, a B-24 pilot during World War II, who flew 35 missions behind German lines and won the Distinguished Flying Cross. As a U.S. Senator from South Dakota, he opposed the war in Vietnam, all the devastation of our napalm and bombs, and progress measured in body counts, and the division the war was causing at home. He lost overwhelmingly to Richard Nixon, and Jimmy Carter, who kept his distance, was spared the taint of the Democratic disaster. In September 1972, 2 months before the Nixon landslide, Hamilton Jordan and Gerald Rafshoon, another of Carter's young aides, went to him with an improbable aspiration. "Governor," they said, "we'd like to have a talk about your future." They urged him to make his own run for the presidency, and it was a measure of Carter's burning ambition that he told them he was thinking about it. Then he smiled and added, "Don't tell anybody. It sounds too ridiculous." It began to sound less so as the Vietnam War raged on and Nixon's presidency dissolved into scandal. When Nixon resigned amid the shame of Watergate, a corruption that would prove to be a warm-up for the new millennium, Carter began to campaign full-time for a goal that suddenly seemed within reach. He was a man with an engineer's mind, a quality nurtured at the U.S. Naval Academy. With technocratic precision, he later explained, "We memorized all the state election laws and set off on a 50-state quest to meet with grassroots Democrats. In living rooms and small convention halls, he subjected himself to the curiosity and skepticism of Democratic leaders, many startled by the force of his intelligence. At those kinds of sessions, Jimmy Carter was a genius," remembered James Fallows, longtime correspondent for The Atlantic, who once served as a Carter speechwriter. There is, I think, an important contrast between his impressiveness in small groups and his larger difficulties as a political leader. But in 1976, some pretty hard-nosed Democratic leaders came away thinking Jimmy Carter was FDR. Part of their fascination inevitably lay in the fact that Carter was Southern. Here was a politician whose decency had been steeled by the most important issue of his time, who could project the experience of the civil rights years into a sense of mission for America. But others were not so sure. Robert Sam Anson, who wrote a cover story about Carter for New Times magazine, was one of literally hundreds of journalists who flocked to the South to try to understand this enigmatic governor with a Georgia accent and oversized smile, who was not what they had in mind for president. Anson wrote, "The South, more than anything, I guess. It was what had secretly bothered me about Carter, that he was one of them, from there, that place. It was not the sort of worry you talked about openly, not unless you were among friends, secure in a Manhattan apartment or in a Georgetown drawing room. And when you owned up to it, admitted that when you heard someone talking with that accent, you mentally clicked down a couple of stops, knowing that whoever he was and whatever he said he did, He thought differently, meaning not as well than you, lived differently, had different values. There was something about those people. They were not Americans in the same way that we were Americans. That place was, in fact, a different country. That skepticism, bordering on antipathy, with a prosperous Georgia farmer moving inexorably toward the White House, soon propelled Anson on a journey to that place, so filled with mystery and revelation. By the time Anson left the South, having traveled its back roads and interstate highways for a month, he amazed himself by writing these words: "If there were any hope left for this country, any hope at all, it was here, in Dixie." Among the stops Anson made was one in Charlotte, North Carolina. He found a proud city emerging from a crisis, for Charlotte, in the early 1970s, had been the national test case for busing. In 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld an order by U.S. District Judge James B. McMillan, a native Southerner, requiring busing, if that's what it took, to completely desegregate the schools. The response of the community was immediate and bitter. Mobs of white protesters regularly besieged the school system's headquarters. At one time or another, during the first several years, racial fighting closed every high school in the system. McMillan was hanged in effigy, and the offices of Julius Chambers, the African-American lawyer in the case, were burned to the ground. By 1976, however, Charlotte had come to a different place. Under a new busing plan designed by a grassroots citizens committee and approved by McMillan, peace had been restored. Test scores in the schools were rising. White flight was minor, and everywhere Anson went, people seemed proud of what they had accomplished. "Busing has worked in Charlotte," he wrote, with some astonishment, for the story was such a contrast to cities like Boston, cities in the North, where the outcome had been much different. No one intrigued Anson more than McMillan, who seemed to be a man who was Southern to the bone, bespectacled, soft-spoken, a Harvard-trained lawyer raised in the swampy flatlands of eastern North Carolina, whose delicate job during World War II had been defusing bombs. He possessed a kind of fatalistic grace as he deflected questions on the effigy hangings and threats on his life, or the subtler ostracism by his former friends at the Charlotte Country Club. But there was too much pain in the gray eyes, Anson wrote, to hide the torment he had gone through, even if he politely refused to talk about it. McMillan, in a sense, embodied both the bravery and the cost of a community coming to terms with its past. Anson would visit other Southern cities, Atlanta, Nashville, Charleston, but he was drawn to the rural places, about which the great James Baldwin had written with dread. In an article for Harper's in 1958, Baldwin described his first glimpse of the Southern landscape, the rust-red soil he could see through the window as his airplane descended toward Atlanta. He said he could not suppress the thought that this earth had acquired its color from the blood that had dripped down from these trees. My mind was filled with the image of a black man, younger than I, perhaps, or my own age, hanging from a tree, while white men watched him and cut out his sex with a knife. The Southern landscape, the trees, the silence, the liquid heat, and the fact that one always seemed to be traveling great distances, seems designed for violence, seems almost to demand it. What passions cannot be unleashed on a Southern night? As Anson began his uneasy trek through the Southern outback, he traveled for a time with Ray Jenkins, editorial page editor of the Alabama Journal in Montgomery. Jenkins, who would soon become a spokesman for Jimmy Carter's State Department, was wise in the ways of the South. One of the stops he made with Anson was the village of Hayneville, where they went to see John Hewlett, the first black sheriff of Lowndes County, Alabama. Lowndes was nestled between Selma and Montgomery, and much of the iconic March of 1965 had followed U.S. Highway 80 past cotton fields and rolling pasture land and dips through moss-draped swamps, the haunted, blood-soaked landscape of Lowndes. 2 infamous murders had occurred in the county in 1965. Viola Liuzzo, a white woman from Michigan who came for the Selma to Montgomery March, was gunned down hours after it ended. 5 months later, after Congress had passed the Voting Rights Act, Jonathan Daniels, a white Episcopal seminarian who supported civil rights, was shotgunned to death at point-blank range by a prominent local white man named Thomas Coleman. In the immediate aftermath of those murders, John Hewlett was part of a cadre of activists who founded what became the Black Panther Party. Its official name was the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, a political party with a panther as its ballot symbol, formed to register black voters and support the wave of African Americans newly emboldened to run for political office. One of the volunteers who came to Lowndes County to support this effort was Huey Newton, a young Californian who admired the militancy of people like Hewlett. Newton carried their symbol back to Oakland, and in 1966 helped form the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Hewlett was never sure what to make of Newton, who seemed to be spoiling for a fight. Hewlett was not like that. By the time of Robert Sam Anson's visit, some of us had come to regard Hewlett as a kind of Nelson Mandela of the Black Belt. As sheriff, he worked to be colorblind, and one of his staunch supporters by then was, remarkably, Tom Coleman, the infamous civil rights murderer. Their cautious friendship began in 1970, 5 years after the Daniels murder, when Hewlett announced he was running for sheriff. "John," asked Coleman, "what are you and your folks going to do?" "Well, Tom," Hewlett replied, "I'm running for sheriff, and I think I'm going to win." "That's okay," said Coleman. "I'm leaving the county." Hewlett responded with a level gaze. "We didn't leave when you were in charge." He went on to say that the electoral victories now looming for blacks, this brave new world of biracial democracy, would not usher in an era of revenge, just an era of fair dealing and equality. He wondered if Coleman could handle such a thing. Sometime later, after Hewlett had won and assumed the mantle of Lowndes County Sheriff, his telephone rang in the middle of the night. It was Coleman, who had been listening, he said, to the police scanner. There had been an accident on I-65. A truck overturned near the town of Fort Deposit, its contents scattered all over the highway. Coleman offered to meet him there and help with the cleanup. Hewlett had to wonder. This was a dark and lonesome stretch of road, and it hadn't been long since Coleman had killed and gotten away with it. But the sheriff said, "Fine, come on down," and the two of them worked until almost morning, cleaning up the debris. That was the way it went until Tom Coleman's death. This middle-aged killer of Jonathan Daniels, this dour and unremarkable man with lines on his face and a look of furtive sadness in his eyes, became one of John Hewlett's most dependable supporters. Not everyone saw Coleman that way, of course. To some, he was merely an unrepentant racist who had committed an unspeakable crime. But Hewlett thought Coleman was trying to reach out, trying, in his gruff and uncertain way, to seek forgiveness for the thing he had done. "Maybe," said Hewlett, "this was all the bravery Coleman could muster." Charles V. Hamilton, a political scientist at Columbia University who, as an African-American activist, had volunteered in the Alabama Black Belt, came to know John Hewlett well. He thought he saw the same qualities in Lowndes County that he would later see in South Africa. From Mandela to Hewlett, these were people with no hatred in their hearts and no interest in revenge. "None whatsoever," said Hamilton. Not long after Ray Jenkins returned to Montgomery, having introduced Hewlett to Robert Sam Anson, he found himself writing a quite remarkable story of his own. On a Sunday morning in 1979, George Wallace, now confined to a wheelchair, paid a visit to Martin Luther King's former church in Montgomery. 7 years earlier, on a campaign stop in Maryland, Wallace had been shot through the spine by a white man, a mentally disturbed, unemployed janitor. Wallace had won 5 Democratic presidential primaries in 1972, with law and order the heart of his message. But now it was over. Now he lay in a hospital bed, depressed, in pain, paralyzed from the waist down. His daughter Peggy was keeping vigil when an unexpected visitor came. Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm was also running for president in 1972. More symbolically than Wallace, perhaps, she was seeking the Democratic nomination, the first black woman ever to do so. On the campaign trail, and as a member of Congress, she was a fierce advocate for the dispossessed, for women and children and people of color, the ideological opposite of Wallace, most people would have said. But now here she was, standing next to his hospital bed, speaking softly, gently, telling him that this terrible thing should not happen to anybody. Peggy Wallace Kennedy remembered them praying. She thought her father was never the same after that, thought the visit set him off on a long and painful journey of introspection, sometimes self-serving and defensive, tinged with self-pity, but sometimes more honest than that. And so, on a 1979 Sunday at Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church, aides wheeled Wallace down the aisle to the storied pulpit, and he told the worshippers, "I have learned what suffering means. I think I can understand something of the pain black people have come to endure. I know I have contributed to that pain, and I can only ask for forgiveness." The people believed him, or so it seemed to Ray Jenkins, for as the choirs sang and the congregation prayed, many wept and reached out to touch him. There were skeptics, of course. Alabama journalist Bob Ingram said that many people thought Wallace was merely auditioning for heaven. Others noted that the governor knew how to count. In these years after the 1965 Voting Rights Act, African Americans had become a political force to be reckoned with. John Lewis was not one of the cynics. The great civil rights leader, a native Alabamian who soon became a member of Congress, would remember several conversations with Wallace, starting in 1979. Private moments in which the governor asked for his forgiveness. It was almost, said Lewis, like someone confessing to a priest. This was the South of Jimmy Carter, the one that he presented to the world. It was still a hard land, riddled with poverty in its rural backwaters and economic inequality in its cities. But there were multiple stories of change, those ripples of redemption that gave people hope. For Carter, as president, and later in his work with the Carter Center in Atlanta, it was an easy transition from support of civil rights in the South to a defense of basic freedoms everywhere in the world. Jacobo Timmerman, a crusading editor in Argentina, thought Carter and his policies saved thousands of lives, including his own. For 30 months, beginning in 1976, Timmerman was one of those jailed and tortured for speaking out against the Argentinian government. He was freed in 1979, largely, he said, because of Carter's human rights pressures. 5 years later, they met. "We were looking at each other," Timmerman remembered. "We were almost the same height, and our faces were at the same level. I said to him, 'How do you feel looking at my face, knowing that you saved my life?' His face flushed red, and he looked down, and then he touched my shoulder. We Latins, we are used to embracing. But he is an American, a very shy person, and yet you could see he was moved." Timmerman paused for a moment. The year was 1985, and war and dread and the reality of oppression still defined too much of the world. But Carter had offered a respite, he said. "It was the first time, and I fear the last, in this violent and criminal century that a major power has defended human rights all over the world. But...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?